There are few brands etched as deeply in American culture as Harley-Davidson. Yet the famous motorcycle maker says it's moving some of its production to Europe. That's a consequence of tit-for-tat tariffs between the US and the EU that the company says may cost it between $100 and $300 million each year.
For Harley to do this is a little bit more of a long-term capital deployment they're doing in this investment, which means they maybe don't see this as much of a transitory issue that's going to be worked out. They might actually think there are going to be some long-run implications.
The company's announcement may have been a cry for help, but it's drawn an entirely different response from the White House.
A Harley-Davidson should never be built in another country, never. Their employees and customers are already very angry at them. If they move, watch, it will be the beginning of the end. They surrendered, they quit. The RL will be gone, and they'll be taxed like never before.
Businesses on the other side of the Atlantic are hardly faring any better. Uncertainty over Brexit has seen investments in Britain's auto industry drop to half of the previous year's tally. Airbus says it may leave the country, cutting up to 100,000 British jobs unless the UK remains in the customs union. And officials at Siemens and BMW say the stance taken by British officials is incredibly unhelpful for boosting jobs and businesses. But they received a snub full of explicitives from Britain's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Boris Johnson. And the country's health minister says their concerns are untimely threats.
Well, I just thought it's completely inappropriate for businesses to be making these kinds of threats for one very simple reason. We are in an absolutely critical moment in the Brexit discussions. And what that means is that we need to get behind Theresa May to deliver the best possible Brexit.
The European Union, Turkey, India and other countries are also hitting back at US tariffs with countermeasures. Officials in each country say they're watching out for their respective economic interests, but their actions may be stifling businesses everywhere. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Lots to talk about. Let's go first to our guests next. And in Paris is our editor-at-large, Craig Copetas. But first, let's go to Chris Roebuck in London. He's a visiting Professor of Transformational Leadership at the Cass Business School. Gentlemen, welcome. Chris, great to have you on the show once again. Have the global trade wars, do you think, started to make a real impact in the real economies of the US, the UK, and in Europe?
Well, I think, you know, somebody, to put it with a firework analogy, someone has lit the blue touch paper, and we will just see how long the fuse takes before it actually explodes. I mean, you know, this is basically political expediency crashing into economic reality. And everybody knows that for the past 70 years, economically, it's been pretty much accepted that free trade is a good idea. But there are various people in political positions around the world now who are taking the view that if they can say we're losing jobs to other people, it will shore up their political position. And the fundamental point is that organisations are now more global, and organisations will produce where they can optimise their profitability. And Trump knows this because his own brand clothing is produced in Bangladesh, China and Indonesia.
Very good point there, Chris. OK, there is the counter argument, though, that 70 years of free trade have led to the phenomenal levels of inequality that we're seeing today. That is something that countries have to deal with. But look, let's talk specifically about some of the companies that are in the headlines today. Harley-Davidson, BMW, even despite that U-turn that they made, Airbus, Honda, Siemens, all of these companies, they rely on very closely woven supply chains, as we've said. Some of these companies are going to be hit by both Brexit and what's happening in the US trade wars, aren't they?
Absolutely. You know, the point about global trade is that, and global organisations, is that effectively you have global supply chains, and no matter what business you're in, various bits and pieces of what you make are made in different places and moved. Therefore, to be blunt, it's a nightmare. And from the organisation's perspective, you know, they're sort of trying to play 3D chess and work out what is the way that we can position everything so that we can optimise profitability for our investors, given that the way politicians are behaving around the world is a movable feast. I mean, I would say that Trump has definitely jumped into one direction and said, right, this is what we're going to do. I think the Brexit is more nuanced, more subtle, because that's about this is what may happen, this is what might happen. So there's an element of positioning going on. But to be blunt, for a British minister to say to a non-British organisation they shouldn't be talking about what is economically good for their company is a bit cheeky.
It is cheeky, isn't it? Craig, let's bring you in on this. I mean, I find it quite amazing that Trump lashed out at Harley-Davidson. You've seen Jeremy Hunt in the UK lashing out at companies that criticise the Brexit process. This is, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, fairly unprecedented. Look, if you were a European leader, you're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, aren't you? Between the US, who's been your partner for decades, but now China's looking rather more appealing as a potential partner. Which way would you lean?
Well, first of all, I think I better translate cheeky into American from the British. It's belligerent mediocrity. That's what it is. That's what's going on here. But one must be polite. Look, fact, the European Union and all democratic countries have a bone to pick with China over trade, whether it's intellectual property, technical transfer, you name it. What Trump failed to do is to trigger what normal politicians and diplomats do, which is to start the personal high-level engagement with the Europeans and other democratic leaders to combat China. Instead of doing that, he has gone off on his own, and he's letting the Chinese run rampant with their $1 trillion plus One Belt, One Road initiative. That's the failure.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about the EU, Craig, for a second. It's been very selective in its retaliatory tariff plan. It's targeting goods, as we've said, from Republican states in the US. Harley-Davidson, its latest warning, is it a sign that the EU strategy is working?
I still maintain the EU as a collective trading body right now is a feckless organization. Where you have to look is the companies, not the WTO. Look, you mentioned BMW. BMW revolutionized South Carolina. The U.S. is now an export center for German cars and Japanese cars. You have South Carolina, you have Mercedes in Alabama, you have Volkswagen in Chattanooga, Tennessee, you have Toyota in Kentucky. So when Trump starts going into the South and saying that these people don't have jobs, these German companies and Japanese companies have gone in there and revolutionized the local economies. Now, why Trump doesn't see this, well, there are reasons why he doesn't see it. As Chris said, it's political, but it is really staggering.
Yeah, it is staggering. I do agree with you on that. Chris, let me ask you the same question. Is the EU strategy working?
No, not really, because one of the problems with the EU is that, as we've seen in terms of immigration, the same as trade, what's going on is that the EU is falling into various groups of people, hardliners on one side or the other, particularly Eastern Europe. People are using any perceived enemy outside as a threat to their democracy and their economy. So the EU isn't performing well. But I think Craig's absolutely right. The failure of this whole thing is, and indeed the failure of the current world trade system, is to address the continuing abuse by China. But, Trump going his own way probably driven by political expediency, working on the basis that he might well get back in before the damage gets too obvious for people to work out he's selling them a line. We will just see, but certainly the EU has just as many problems.
Yeah.
There's a very important point here. The difference between Europe and the United States is something called the 401k plan, which is a savings plan. And under Trump, as long as the markets boom, that's what's created this Trump hive mind. People are making money, and the religion of America is making money. Now, the U.S., these people, as long as their 401k plans grow, they do not care that the United States is no longer a reliable global partner.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Quick question to you both. Craig first. Trump wants to level the playing field. He wants a world with no trade barriers at all, with no trade tariffs at all. Is that possible?
No.
Okay.
Next question.
Chris, a world without trade tariffs?
No. One, no, but two, if he got it, it would probably destroy much of American industry.
Yes, indeed. Because a lot of the industry would go to the cheapest places where you could manufacture those goods, right? Absolutely.
Economics and political expediency.
Yeah, where they collide, where we began. Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. Chris Roebuck of the Cass Business School and Craig Copetas, of course, in Paris. Thank you.